Tayo nag-check ng audio.
Oo, yung sa kagabi.
Pero pakiano mo na lang yung yung first minutes para tayo.
Sige.
Mamasig tayo.
Oo.
Okay. Sige po. On your part, Ronald, ready ka na?
Oo, naka-broadcast na yung please stand by na slide.
Sige po. Si Ma'am Lori po, kanina pa ready.
Ako rin hindi na pa ready. Hindi lang ako nakakonet.
Sabi ko na may nangyari sa connection yung
Okay. So, siguro accepting the attendees, we will start. We will start.
Actually, cue mo ako, ha?
Yes, ma'am. Opo. Ma'am, ang queuing natin sa FB.
Okay.
Po, let us start.
Sorry, may background ako. May aso ko dito. Sorry, ha?
Yes, ma'am.
Lagyan mo ng mask.
now.
Mabuhay! Welcome to the second day of the 41st National Conference on National and Local History webinar series. I am Lorelei Deviana, your moderator for today's session. The online conference is organized by the PNHS in partnership with the NCCA and the Philippine Social Science Council. We would like to acknowledge the following: the NCCA headed by Chairman Nick Lizazo, Executive Director Al Ryan Alejandre, and PPFD Division Head Bernan Joseph Corpus. PNHS members and officers headed by Dr. Bernardita Churchill, officers and members of the Manila Studies Association, participants via Zoom, and participants via FB Live. We are live on Facebook via PNHS and MSA pages. We also would like to remind everyone that the proceedings of this webinar are recorded for purposes of documentation. Just a reminder, please write your comments or questions in the chat box for the speakers to answer at the end of the session. Please indicate your name and your institutional affiliation. We will have an open forum after the second speaker and another one after the last speaker. Now, to formally begin our program, please allow me to introduce you to our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Maria Mercedes G. Planta. She is a professor in the Department of History of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She obtained her PhD in history from the National University of Singapore. Her areas of specialization are history of medicine and colonial Southeast Asia. Her book, Traditional Medicine in the Colonial Philippines, 16th to the 19th Century, won the National Book Award for Best Book in Science. She has been awarded the title of University Scientist 1 for 2019 to 2021. Today, she is presenting The Philippines and Pandemics in World History, an Overview. The second paper, The Jungle University, 1942 to 1945, Silliman University during the Japanese occupation in Negros Island, will be presented by Dr. Earl Jude CLEOPE. He is Vice President for Academic Affairs of Silliman University. He obtained his degrees in MA History from Silliman University and PhD History from UST. Dr. CLEOPE specializes in the history of the Visayas and World War II. Again, this conference is organized by the PNHS in partnership with the NCCA and the Philippine Social Science Center. Thank you again to our participants who registered for this event. We hope that we will be able to learn a lot this morning. Now, we would like to call on Dr. Planta.
Open ako ng video, di ba? Umaga po sa lahat. Mag-share po ako ng screen. So, yung ipipresent ko today, to provide a general overview of how we make sense of COVID-19, Philippine history, and in historical times as well as in the contemporary period. This paper is made with 5 objectives: to clarify our historical experience of epidemics and pandemics, primarily by establishing their difference. Some of us don't really understand that epidemics and pandemics are 2 different things. So, I can provide a context for our particular historical experience, lay the stage towards an understanding of the development of Filipinos' understanding of epidemics and pandemics in general, provide a general account of the intended result of the pandemic and its impact on contemporary social and cultural life of Filipinos, and more importantly, to establish that what we are being told to do to keep safe from COVID-19 now are actually practices that are not effective. So the current pandemic that we are undergoing is something that humankind has not is not a new experience to humankind. As much as we experience disasters, typhoons, these are all part of our experiences, but they are unique in a particular context. So I will try to talk about that uniqueness. So first, we have to differentiate between a pandemic and an epidemic. I begin my presentation with this differentiation because most of the time we think that in the 20th century or in the latter part of the 20th century, we have experienced a pandemic or an epidemic in the Philippines. One of the earliest works that I have read in this regard is the recent SARS epidemic that has gripped Southeast Asia and many parts of the world, but it is not a pandemic as much as COVID-19 now. So not all infectious diseases are created equal, meaning not everything is a pandemic or a pandemic. The blurred distinction between terms and usage of such terms as pandemic and epidemic happen even among medical experts because diseases become more or less prevalent over time. So an infectious disease can be an epidemic and can remain that way, but sometimes it can also escalate into a pandemic. But the easier way to understand the difference is that an epidemic is a disease that affects a larger number of people within a community, population, or region. So medyo localized ito. A pandemic is an epidemic that is spread over multiple countries or continents. So a simple way to know the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic is to remember the P in pandemic, which means a pandemic has a passport. So a pandemic is an epidemic that travels. But unlike an ordinary individual who is a passport, a pandemic does not require a visa. So it can just go anywhere. So that's a very simple distinction. Pandemics have always been part of human history. So the earliest in recorded history was the Antonine Plague in 165 to 180 AD, which was believed to be either smallpox or measles. The Antonine Plague, or the Plague of Galen, for those of us who probably like to look at the history of medicine, Galen is one of the most important turning points in the understanding of the history of medicine because he's one of the first. He promoted the four humors, and he was the physician who described the first earliest plague in human history. So it was known by troops returning from the war campaigns in the Near East, traditionally a geographical term which roughly encompasses a transcontinental region that makes up Western Asia, Turkey, and Egypt. We no longer use this reference today. So this is an example of a depiction of one of the. Actually, this is a biblical depiction of the plague before Moses was crossing the Red Sea. So I'm sure most Catholics are familiar with that story. But this is just to show you not only that there was a plague in the past, but also because this was one of the ways in which we understood it. So in the time of biblical times, the understanding of plague has nothing to do with science, but a lot to do with religion, primarily as an act of God. So these are the pandemics throughout history. So we begin with the Antonine Plague in 165 to 180 AD, and then this is the ongoing COVID-19. Some of the more prominent plagues, we have the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague. Cholera epidemics have always been part of world history. In fact, in the Philippines, we also had that. We have yellow fever, but not really much for the Philippines. And of course, the Spanish flu, which was a plague that was a pandemic too in the 20th century. So these are the death tolls in terms of the deaths that have accumulated over the centuries and the plagues or epidemics and pandemics that have been responsible for these numbers. So the Black Death had 200 million deaths. The outbreak wiped out 30 to 50% of Europe's population. It took more than 200 years for the continent's population to recover. So it is a plague that originated from rats and spread to humans via infected fleas. More familiar with us would be smallpox, especially in the period of the American rule. It killed an estimated 90% of Native Americans. In Europe, during the 1800s, an estimated 400,000 people were being killed by smallpox annually. The first ever vaccine was created to ward off smallpox. You remember that smallpox is very significant for the Philippines because it was the vaccine that was made to arrest it was not yet available. Number two, it was not really available in the Philippines. It was that its transport was difficult to undertake until the time of King Philip, where the vaccine was transported in such a way that kids were vaccinated and were made to travel by ship until finally so pinapasa-pasa yung vaccine until finally it was brought to the Philippines. So this is a 1918 photo of Red Cross volunteers in Boston. So this is 1918 influenza pandemic. So we see that this shows a photo of Red Cross volunteers wearing PPEs that are not as sophisticated as what we have today. So over time, our way with dealing with the flu is one of the most amazing infectious disease because it is supposed to be very simple. But its simplicity is not equal to its virulence. Ito ay isang sakit lang na sipon at ubo, but look at what we are experiencing right now. So silang lahat ay naka-PPE, hindi lang kasing sophisticated ng PPE natin today. So at that time, this is in the early 1900s, there was a campaign to promote the medical profession, primarily nursing profession. In the Philippines, the nursing profession came into being under the Americans. At that time, women were not really allowed to, not only that they were not allowed to work, it was almost different for a woman to be able to work, especially to become a nurse, because it meant that someone had to go to school, get an education, a proper education, and instead of caring for her family, which most women were viewed then at that time, to become a nurse means that a woman is not necessarily bound to just stay at home. So in the early 20th century, because of the diseases that were occurring in the Philippines, we begin with the cholera epidemic of 1902. You have smallpox. The most important at that time was cholera because it kept on recurring. And then in 1918, you have the influenza pandemic. We had a shortage of nurses. And so the Americans, in order to encourage more women to work, at that time, nursing was only a profession that was more or less associated with men, as most other professions were. So to encourage women to go to school, to actually be a nurse, was made in such a way that it was associated with being a nationalist. So if you want to do something for your country, to become a nurse is one of the ways to help your country. So, but in the US, we see that nurses are being enticed in the early 20th century to go into the nursing profession because they can earn $15 to $25 a week. But we know that in the COVID-19 epidemic, especially at the height of the lockdown, nurses were not only paid $15 to $25 a week. I think they were earning about, I don't know, in Chicago, probably about 1,000 a day, something like that. But outrageously attractive remuneration just to become a nurse. And we remember at the height of the pandemic, why such a big amount to become a nurse? Because it meant that in the beginning, we all remember we did not have PPEs. And so it meant that if you were to become a nurse, you have to recycle your PPEs at the very least, if you have one. It means the risk was higher. So probably that's why the remuneration was very big, it was very high. So this is also a photo of the early 20th century. This is a poster that says, if you want to prevent influenza, pneumonia and tuberculosis, this is by the Anti-Tuberculosis League of the Board of Health. You have to keep your bedroom windows open. Now, as we are as we are being affected by COVID-19, these are things that we also know or are being reminded on us almost every single time, that we have to stay in open places, that areas that are enclosed, probably those with air conditioning, are supposed to be more or less avoided because we have to have a clear flow of air traffic to prevent the virus from staying in the air. Of course, the idea that the virus is airborne has been much debated upon, especially in areas outside the hospitals. So these are their photos of this is the Red Cross personnel demonstrating how this is a photo taken during the height of the influenza pandemic. And here they are again. These are photos of Red Cross personnel, Red Cross volunteers. And we see them wearing their PPEs, but their PPEs are very, very simple. So now we hear from WHO, from Dr. Fauci, that we all have to wear surgical masks. But because of the shortage of surgical masks, people are being told that we have to reserve our surgical masks for medical personnel. For people, ordinary people like us, we can survive with a cloth mask, which actually makes sense, but in many instances doesn't really make sense, only because the protection it offers is not so much. But so you have to do other things like wash your hands, don't go to crowded places. But here, in the early 20th century, we see their masks are very simple. They're not even wearing PPEs. I remember sometime about 2 months ago, or a month ago, there was a mountain of trash that was thrown over in EDSA by one company that was supposed to clean up, take care of the waste of hospitals. For some reason, the waste got spilled along EDSA, and people were cleaning the street and not wearing the proper gear. And everybody was concerned that these are waste matter from hospitals, and supposed to be handled with care. But look at them. This is the height of the influenza pandemic. He is just simply cleaning the street. What he does is not different from ours. It is just that we know in the 21st century, we know better. And because COVID-19 is something that we never have yet experienced. So this is, now people are saying that we need to not stay in crowded places. So this is an example of how people adjusted at the time. So we don't have an open air court. But here we have it probably because we need to have air and to have proper circulation to avoid infection. So another photo. So in human history, the most important killers are cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, and influenza. These are the four most brutal, most virulent infectious diseases over all of our human history. Outbreaks of these diseases across international borders are properly defined as pandemic. The 20th century and the challenge of modernity. So the 20th century is an era of modernity. It bears witness to one of the worst pandemics in human history. This is the influenza pandemic. It is worse not only because of the number of people it claimed, but also because we are supposed to be in a modern era. 20th century is one of the most amazing times in human history because of so many astonishing feats. We have reduction of poverty, the spread of literacy, the rise of secular and scientific thought that was so different from the other centuries that have gone before us. And yet, how come that we have an influenza pandemic? It was something that we are supposed to be prepared for, but actually, probably equality for all, the idea of human rights, a 20th century phenomena, and yet we had the influenza pandemic. However, because the 20th century as a period of modernity is also associated with scientific thought, it was assumed that people can deal with influenza better, as we can deal with COVID-19 now. But it was also, 20th century, most significant challenge to human capacities. So you have the influenza pandemic, at the same time you have... So here are the basic things that people were made to do in the time of the influenza pandemic. To wear a mask, but their mask is not as nice as ours, or probably not as sophisticated. Spanish influenzas endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. So it came at the time of war. There are 1,500 cases in the Navy Yard. 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Don't spit. These things I have not seen in the Philippines. I mean, Filipinos also spit, but probably not as either it's just two things. Either it's not as prevalent, or we don't really care because it's a common thing. But these things that people have warned us about during the influenza pandemic are things that we are being told to do now under COVID. So theoretically, the more civilized we are, and the more we develop in terms of having larger cities, expanding trade routes, and increased contact with different populations of people, animals, and ecosystems, the more likely that pandemics will occur. While we never probably imagined that we will all live through a pandemic, our human experience theoretically have prepared us for it. So essentially, we have come far from dealing with pandemics, from viewing disease. So for instance, at least in the Philippines, no one questions the wearing of masks. The question is whether masks are available for everyone. These are two different things, but equally important. So while COVID-19 now is the primary enemy, our situation, as with the rest of the world, demonstrates how public health matters, especially on a global scale, and masks many of the ills of modern society that we have largely chosen to ignore. For instance, they say that Typhoon Ulysses, which has affected all of us, is worse than Ondoy, only because we have seen its wrath. It came at the time of the pandemic. But when you really study it, Typhoon Ulysses would not have been as worse as Ondoy if it was not preceded by Typhoon Rolly because Typhoon Rolly already made our mountains full with COVID-19 in the Philippines. We have environmental issues to deal with. In other parts of the world, the issue of race, social inequality becomes more pronounced. Issues of gender violence in the Philippines, the most significant is corruption in the period of COVID-19. Amidst all that, you have territorial disputes. These are some of the more prominent issues that have surfaced along with the world's current battle with COVID-19. So as we move towards understanding of diseases from purely something that is divine, probably that is scientific, as our ways of coping with it are being made better because technology in the period of COVID-19 has been embedded in our lives more than ever in human history. So we are theoretically more equipped to deal with this. We have tracing apps for tracking of COVID-19 carriers, all these things. But how come we are in such a mess? Because COVID-19 is no longer just a simple matter of public health issue. So I want to be optimistic that COVID-19 is an opportunity for us, not just to solve it, but to solve COVID-19 is also to look at how Filipinos have gone so far in our history. Something that they say that Filipinos are pasaway, but that is not necessarily true. When you look at the COVID-19 cooperation of the Filipino people, it look at the United States. It's like, Ma'am Churchill, hello. So every day, the number of deaths are staggering. We don't have that. Let's just say our recording system is not the most perfect. But in terms of cooperation from ordinary citizens, our compliance with wearing face shields, our compliance with surgical masks, of wearing of masks in general, these are things that we have generally been very compliant with as a general rule. So I don't know where the pasaway is coming from, especially when we look at ourselves in comparison to others that are in the same boat. So, anyway. So, asan ba ako?
The university had a newly elevated status from an institute to a university just in 1938, carried with it the tag as the oldest established American educational institution in the country, and was still administered by Americans and missionaries. So, of course, the Japanese are coming and the enemy is America, and here comes an American institution. And so this presentation endeavors to examine the unhampered operation of the university in the jungles of the mountains of Negros Oriental, despite the occupation of the whole campus by the Japanese imperial forces. It must be underscored that the university did not officially close. As the last Silliman University American president, Dr. Arthur Carson, puts it, it just had a long layover. So in this presentation, I looked into the accounts of the faculty, staff, and students, as well as the memoirs of administrators and American missionaries, including issuances of the military and guerrilla units, in order to present to you a wartime educational institution operations. And hopefully this would offer a fresh perspective on the re-examination of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. So I hope it is clear. On my screen, you see these are all unpublished materials that are still in our library. The blue one is entitled Sa Kabukiran, and you see it's somebody in the 1950s just had it book-bound so that it will be preserved. And the other one is a unique thesis. By the way, the blue one is written by Arthur Carson. He's a graduate of Cornell, just like Ma'am Churchill. And then, of course, this one is a thesis that was presented in Columbia University by Aquilino Layage in 1948. So this one also is talking about the school. And, of course, that is Dr. Arthur Carson. He was the last American president, and he was the wartime president. After leaving Silliman, he also served as the president of the now University University of the Trinity University of Asia. So that's Arthur Carson. Okay, so you have here the map of Negros Island, and on the eastern side is Negros Oriental. So the blue ones are the evacuation places where the university operations continued. So I hope you can see my cursor. That's the Silliman campus. These are the mountains of Valencia. So here in Malabo and the Twin Lakes, Danao, there's an operating school. Okay, and then another one in the hinterlands of Shaton. And then another one in here and up to the Bayawan Tulong area. Another one in Bais. And another one in La Libertad and Gihulngan. And then subsequently, from these operations, when the civic affairs, the civilian government was installed, the university also reached out to the establishment of the different public schools in the free territories. Next slide. So let's take a look at the first site, Malabo. This is Roy Bell. These actually the people that I'll mention are all faculty of Silliman who evacuated into the mountains. So Roy Bell was a physics professor, and also he became the leader of the civic military affairs. And Edna Bell, the wife, is also an elementary teacher. So in the evacuation areas, those students, parents, and those evacuees that went with them continued the operations of the school. And in fact, there's a book that actually is documenting the stories of the bells in that part of the province, and that is Stranded in the Philippines by Scott Mills. So Professor Bell's Private War Against the Japanese. So that's the book. All right. Then in the other side, in the northern side, La Libertad and Gihulngan, was Reverend Dr. Proculo Rodriguez and Virginia McKinley and her husband. There, they continued the university and the schooling system wherever possible. So that's it. That's in the Mayapusi area. And then, in the Malabo area, where the bells are, of course, the Carsons were there, and the president, and of course, Ed Carson was also a member of the faculty. And so they continued. As I've said, the Kabukiran alone, the unpublished manuscript has about 800 pages handwritten that depicts their story in the hills, Bukid, in Cebuano, sa Kabukiran actually is in the mountains, in the hills and mountains. So they continued the operation. In fact, correspondence with students continued because of the sailboat traffic between the coast of Dumaguete to Dipolog. Apparently, the Dipolog area, northern Mindanao, was not that protected by the Japanese. So the sailboats formed a link of the correspondence between teachers and students in Mindanao. Okay, and then of course another area north is Gihulngan and La Libertad. So this is the northernmost part, and there was this school that was also established by Reverend Paul Lindholm. And he even wrote an account about it. It's a good book, Shadows from the Rising Sun. Lindholm's family and the Carsons were the Americans who were picked up by the boat, the submarine Creval, which of course carried the Koga papers to be decoded that showed that Leyte was an underbelly. So it's also a long story. So this was Paul Lindholm, who continued the education and religious activities in that part of the province. And of course, in the south, where the trio of Robert Silliman, his wife Meta, and Meta's sister Abby, these three continued the university operation on the southern side of Negros Oriental. In fact, Robert Silliman became the deputy governor of the 6th military district of Negros as well. And so if we take a look at the operation of the university, it also was linked with the operation of the civilian authority as established and by Governor Montelibano under the military leadership of Colonel Absede. And so this continued, and of course, these two, Robert Silliman and Meta, were the pioneering teachers also of the community schools in that part of the island. Some of the schools that they established, in fact, after the war, were adopted and were continued to become now part of the public school system, because the supervisor also that was appointed by the Montelibano government was Sillimanian, and most of the faculty members that were appointed were Sillimanians as well. In fact, Robert Silliman wrote also a book, but it's out of press, but it's entitled Pocket of Resistance. So that's his book. And recently, there was a publication written by Tony Nelb. It's entitled Mission Accomplished. And this is also a full documentation from the Presbyterian record papers of the Sillimans in Yale, depicting the story of the Silliman in those areas. Okay, I will show you some about five documents. This is taken from Carson's paper documents in the library, and so as you can see, this was the faculty list that they have by January 30 of 1944. So you have there all the members of the university committee, including the tasks. And so that's an example that there are documents that will show that it's still operating. In fact, the printing press of the university was actually made to print the Montelibano money from the papers also that they were able to bring to the mountains. Okay, and the next slide will show you, although it's not very, very clear because this was from the files, of a Memorial Day program in 1943, May 30. A sample of their program, so they have the opening remarks and declamation and the tableau and the speech and the vocal folk dance, including the reading of the victory news, item number 9, and then field dance, hymns, and others. And so the time was 4:30. So this was the program of the memorial service as early as even in the wartime, at the height of the war situation, 1943. And then another is the directive of the Civil Affairs Office of Negros Oriental, dated February 1, 1943, stating that there should schools in the free areas should be reopened. So this was a memo to supervising teachers, principals, and teachers. So see the underlined, you can open undercover, attendance is voluntary. And the teacher's compensation, not to exceed 25 pesos per month. So that's an example also of the semblance of operation even in the public school system. And then, this is taken from the thesis in 1948. It will show you the distribution of schools of Free Negros Oriental from January 1 to June 30 of 1943. The red ones are areas that are Japanese-occupied towns. But if you notice in the southern towns, they are not occupied. So you have the green, which says free towns where schools were established. So you basically have all these towns. And this area here is where the pickup of the submarine, there were about 18 pickups all here that happened all throughout the war. Another map is the distribution of schools of Free Negros Oriental from December 1944 to April 1945. And as you can see, there were now a lot of towns that were freed, and the Japanese were just holed up in Dumaguete. And so Silliman and the rest of the public school system also opened. Okay, and this one is very unique because it shows you the minutes of the faculty meeting that happened in the southern part at 10 o'clock on January 30, 1944. And as you noticed, this was President Carson presiding and all those people there. But actually, they were talking about, if you take a look at the agenda, they were talking about accounts, because right before they evacuated, Silliman gave to teachers bonuses and advanced payment for about 3 months. And so that's why they were also talking about salaries that should be paid. And then they were talking already about rehabilitation fund and the retirement policy. And to make the story short, 2 days after this, Carson and the rest were picked up by the submarine. So as you can see, this is a document that shows the operation still of the university. And okay, I think before I will say my last daghang salamat, I'll just read my the concluding notes. So in all these things, to remedy school problems, private houses were rented and temporary buildings were constructed through cooperative efforts. And they shared their supplies and equipment, and the grounds and the small private homes were also made as schools. And sometimes there were no tables to write on and papers and pencils, but they continued. These observations were supported by a lot of written accounts. And so in essence, the story of the university and the public school system is really a tale of wartime courage. It is a story of teachers, students, and parents with empty stomachs and practically no clothes because it became a problem, whose houses were makeshift and uncertain, who suffered from malaria, dysentery, and other diseases that could not heal for lack of medicines. It is also a story of courage, that they would rather succumb to diseases than surrender. And so, despite these hardships, the people cooperated with the school authorities in pushing through the wartime educational program. Even if the teachers' compensation was only a meager allowance, they continued to teach, and the people willingly shared with the teachers whatever food they had so that the schools could continue. And supervisors traveled from school to school, seldom passing on a beaten trail, and sometimes in the cover of darkness in order to evade enemy patrols. Classes were also moved from one place to another at times when enemy patrols were expected to pass by. And they have this general rule that the Japanese will always patrol in the morning at 8:30 to 10. So they know when the Japanese will make the patrol. So if the Japanese operations intensified in an area, people moved to another place and the schools disbanded. So fundamentally, the school helped build up the morale of the people. They can be likened to the winds that fanned the fervor of the resistance. The teachers disseminated the news and the school served as a well-organized agency in circulating the good news of the war, thus helping to keep the morale of the civilian population high. The teachers became synonymous with the victory. What happened?
Hello, we seem to have an internet problem. Internet connection with Dr. Earl CLEOPE has been disrupted. So in the meantime, while we are waiting for him to come back, maybe have Professor Planta. We have a question here for her. Professor Planta. Yes, okay. So the question is from Mr. Mario De Guinod. Ma'am, is it possible or a must now to include pandemics and the likes to be part of the content course or subject in the DepEd-CHED curriculum?
Hello, magandang umaga kay Sir Mario. Bakit tumatawag sa akin si PNHS? Bakit kaya?
Yes, kasi
stop na. Ay, sasagutin ko? PNHS calling.
Wait.
Stop ba? Sa tingin ko po, hindi naman. I don't think you need to make a specific content course for pandemics and epidemics. Sa tingin ko po, hindi na kailangan. Ang kailangan lang, di ba, meron naman yata tayong science living. Ano bang pangalan ng subject na yun sa elementary? Di ba, parang how to be a healthy individual. Tingin ko, mas i-emphasize na lang siguro yun. I mean, hygiene, how to wash hands properly. Tingin ko yun mas i-emphasize po yun. How to be more healthy, the kind of food that we eat. Nawala na kasi yung I don't know if it materialized, pero 'di ba parang ibabalik yata nila yung Nutriban to stave off malnutrition. I don't know. But those things, we used to have that in the past. Maybe it's time to think about bringing something of those practices now, but not necessarily as a particular content course. Yun lang po.
Thank you very much, Professor Planta. Okay, so I would like to ask a question regarding the flu pandemic here in the Philippines. Were the people really informed that there was a killer pandemic, that they have to have health protocols to observe? Or were they really, what happened then? Would you know?
Di ba sinasabi naman nila, the COVID-19 is not a death sentence.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, it used to be that people there are more vulnerable sectors because they have either senior sila or may comorbidity sila. But at least in the case of the Philippines, hindi na ganon. Wala na tayong specific age group. Hindi na rin necessarily that if you have a comorbidity, that will be the end of it. Hindi na. It is just that in the beginning, I think people were, syempre takot lahat. People did not know what to do. Our healthcare system became under a lot of stress. So hindi siya natutugunan ng mabuti. Yun lang yun. But were people informed? Yes. But I remember that even in the midst of all the panic, we were told that COVID-19 is not a death sentence. It is just that you don't want to be in that situation where everyone is in the hospital, no one will care for you, you will be alone, we don't have a vaccine. Yun lang. Okay po.
Okay. Maraming salamat po, Professor Planta. Now, Dr. Earl just messaged us that he is back. So may we have your...
there was a power interruption.
Yes.
Kala ko, kinakat ako ni Ronald at ni Sir Jude.
Sige po, you're going to end your presentation, diba? You were discussing your conclusion.
Yeah, actually, it was just 2 sentences. So,
okay, so
in other words, to end, thank you. Daghang salamat. That's the one that I missed. Timing. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Earl, so I have a question for you. So in this jungle university, so were they able to promote, so was it like a regular class? Were they able to promote people from grade to a higher grade, or did they graduate certain batches? How was it? Or was it just informal lectures for everyone who just wanted to continue learning?
Okay.
Or yeah.
In the story, kasi mahaba yung paper, I placed there instances where this correspondence between students and teacher continued, and they earned credits for it when classes resumed. In fact, after the parang ODL na rin, online distance learning, pero distance learning lang, walang online, wartime distance learning. So yung mga parang modules, may in the public school system, may mass promotion na nangyari, especially in areas where they were treated as certified as free territories. But in Silliman's case, those that continue because of the teachers, may mga records, were given credits. In fact, even as early as November of 1944, while the battle in Leyte raged on, there were already classes, nominal classes that were happening, because in that minutes of the meeting, the university also appointed Dean Gaudel of the College of Law as the temporary caretaker, and I think they were given about 1,000 pesos just to have the money to start up operations. So right after because Silliman was occupied by the Japanese, so even right after they feel that because there was this constant contact between the guerrillas and the leadership and the people in the territory, no less than the mayor also had contacts with them. All the political officials here had contacts with them. So they came over and they started the class. But although the administration building and most of the documents that were kept in the library were destroyed, but luckily just before they left, they hid all the books at the underground. We call that the catacombs below the church. There's that catacomb there, and that's where all these books were preserved. So yes, so merong
Thank you very much.
there were credits that were given.
Okay, thank you. Yes, there is another question from Dr. NELA Florendo to Dr. CLEOPE. Did the Japanese or the school try to foster quote-unquote good relations with each other?
When they arrived, basically, as they said, they were quite friendly. But ito yung interesting story. Before the war, most of the buildings were constructed, they were hiring Japanese carpenters. And so in other words, there were Japanese, especially mga foreman at yung mga owner ng bazaars, who were friendly to Dr. Hibbard and the rest of the faculty. In fact, they were just, they claimed that some of them were actually the reason why they had a kind of an advanced information that the Japanese really are coming. And in terms of, at first they said that, they were trying to build good relationships, but when they learned that most of the army and most of the officers, especially the ROTC unit of Silliman, now is the army, and when they learned that the commandant of the ROTC unit was now, appointed by MacArthur as the head of the whole Negros, the 7th military district, that ended the straw. They could not, But of course, in my previous paper, in one of the seminars, they cannot let go with the doctors and nurses of the Silliman Hospital. So some of them stayed, but almost all faculty, especially the American missionaries, they really went to the hills.
Thank you very much, sir. Now we have another question for Professor Planta. So this is from Marco Paulo. Question to Dr. Planta. During the course of the various pandemics in world history, is there any particular pattern on how these pandemics ended?
Wala naman po. Yung influenza, it just went away. In our most recent experience, which is SARS just went away on its own. So wala po talagang, hindi po all the time vaccine yung katapat.
Okay. Yeah. So maraming salamat po, Dr. Planta and Dr. CLEOPE. Thank you very much. Now, everyone, can we type mabuhay to applaud, to virtually applaud our speakers? We can type mabuhay in the chat box.
Mabuhay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po. Now, for intermission, we would like to greet our participants. They come from Isabela, Pangasinan, Laguna, Dumaguete, Surigao, Cavite, Iloilo, Samar, even Seattle, Washington. And Dr. Churchill is now in Washington, D.C. So mabuhay, maraming salamat po sa pagdalo sa aming komperensya. Now we go to the next part of our program. Our next speakers are Professor Regalado T. Jose and EDGAR Allan Sembrano. Their paper is Juana Manahin, Bulacan Heiress, and her 1694 will. Professor Jose is archivist of the University of Santo Tomas Archives. He studied AB Anthropology and MA Philippine Studies, major in art history in the University of the Philippines. His specializations are anthropology, art history, and cultural heritage. He has been awarded many times the National Book Award for the Art category in 1992 for Simbahan, Cultural Center of the Philippines Centennial Award for the Arts in 1999, Basic Research Achievement Award in the Humanities by the National Research Council of the Philippines 2011, and Patnubay ng Sining at Kalinangan sa Larangan ng Panitikan ng Kasaysayan, City of Manila 2013. Edgar Allan M. Sembrano is Associate Researcher in the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School, Center for Conservation of Cultural Property and Environment in the Tropics. He obtained his BA in journalism from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines and MA in Cultural Heritage Studies from the USC Graduate School. He specializes in built heritage, heritage conservation, and Spanish colonial dams. Now, our last speaker for today is Dr. Marianela B. Florendo. Dr. Florendo is a professor of history and chair of the Department of History and Philosophy in the University of the Philippines, Baguio. She obtained her PhD Philippine Studies degree from UP Diliman. Her areas of specialization and research interests include social history, Cordillera history, Southeast Asian history, history of indigenous peoples in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and Northern Luzon history. She was a Fulbright Senior Research Scholar in the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2008, and Fulbright Scholar in Residence in the University of Memphis, Lambeth in 2016 to 2017. Her presentation is Tuloy po kayo sa virtual classroom ko, Teaching Philippine History Online. Now may we call on Professor Jose and Mr. EDGAR ALLAN SEMBRANO.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for being with us today, despite all the difficult weather conditions. Let me start my PowerPoint. There. If there are any questions, if you cannot see the slides, can you please text me or message me? Okay. Most of the 17th century in the Philippines has been characterized by disasters, warring factions, archbishops quarreling with governors general, and wars. So I'd like to present something that is relatively unknown. A lady, particularly of the late 17th century. Most of our sources talk about the Spaniards in the Philippines, but we have very little about the voices from the natives themselves. So there is this document, a will by Juana Manahin, which I will share with you. The second part of this presentation will be presented by Mr. E.A. Sembrano, because there's a large part of it concerning her properties. So the document of Juana Manahin is titled Testament and Dispositions of the Properties of Doña Juana Manahin, which was eventually intended for a chaplaincy or capellania for the Augustinians to carry out. The document was dictated in Tagalog on her deathbed by Doña Juana Manahin on 23 July 1691 in Bambang, Bulacan. And in 1694, it was translated into Spanish, and that is the version that we have here. So sayang we don't have the Tagalog original. Since it was addressed to the Augustinian friars for the chaplaincy, it was kept first in the Augustinian archives in San Agustin, Manila. Then, when the Augustinians transferred the archives, this document went with them to the archives in Valladolid in Spain. And that is where we found this document. So I will go through some of the sections of the document so we can see some of the life of Doña Juana Manahin. So she was born in Puerto de Cavite of parents Don Juan Cartorla and Doña Maria Sitain, who were both dead already by the time the document was written. And she was married to Don Bernabe Aligid, a resident and citizen of Banban. Actually, he also eventually became the governor of the province of Bulacan, yes, later in clause 141. And apparently, her mother died at an early age, and she was taken care of by another lady, Doña Monica Landayin. And so this lady also passed on some of her lands and properties to Doña Juana Manahin. Based on the document of Doña Juana, the place names are raised here in Bulacan. She grew up here. She was born in Cavite, but she mentions places in Manila. And they had the bangka, which came from Abukay, and she had some cloth, which came from Lumbang. So these are some of the places mentioned in her will, apart from the smaller barrios in Bambang in Bulacan. The first thing she did was to offer her life to the Lord, and that she said that when she would be buried, she would like to be buried in the black habit of the Augustinians with the cincture of Saint Augustine. And so this is a cincture here, and this is a stylized representation of the cincture in Bolhoon in Cebu. She would like to be buried in the church of Bulacan. This is the present day Bulacan. This is not how it looked in Doña Juana Manahin's time. And for that, she would pay, she had set aside 50 pesos, which is quite a sum at that time. Then a set of instructions on what to do for the celebration of her burial, masses, novenas, candles, lightings, and singers. And there would also be a ritual in front of the church nearer their place in Bambang itself, which is dedicated to San Roque. So all of these details have their corresponding prices. So a response would be sung in her home chapel of Bambang, and when she was to be buried, they would carry a silver cross like this. This is a 17th century silver cross. Very, very detailed will on what she wanted to do for her funeral. And she set aside amounts of money for celebration of masses with specified churches. So the first one was 4 reales, which is half a peso, for the Church of Biglang Awa, which is unusual because the church is known as the Church of Parian, dedicated to the 3 kings. But we know that there was an image here dedicated to Biglang Awa, and there's also a bell, Biglang Awa, which is now in Makati. So Doña Juana Manahin referred to this church by her, by the image of Our Lady of Biglang Awa. Then she also sent corresponding amounts for masses to be said in the principal churches in Intramuros, the Franciscans, the Augustinian Recollects, the Jesuits, the Augustinians, the Cathedral of Manila, and the Dominicans, 4 reales each. As we go through the list of her clauses, we find a lot of the former governor, the Silios of the town of Bulacan mentioned. This is a list prepared by Ian Alfonso in his book of Bulacan, and I have encircled in yellow the former mayors whom they were involved with. The house that they erected, the land where they erected their house was obtained from a former captain, Capitan Miguel de Malipol, and the executor of her will, or albacea, was a former mayor also, Nicolas de Tolentino, and another mayor was a nephew of her husband. So she was, Doña Juana Manahin, in short, was well connected, and Mr. Sembrano will show you later on the lands that were acquired from these prominent personalities. The house is mentioned. It says there that they had the House of Malave of 6 ariges or house posts, and I presume this would be 6 house posts per side, not for the entire house, but 6, so that maybe for 4 sides you would have 24 house pillars. And because of the translation, it says that the construction is of copies, but I believe that the translation should be copies windows. So comparing this house with the house of Doña Isabel Pinheiro of 1699, about the same time, this time in Intramuros, it would be approximately about the same size, slightly smaller than the house in Intramuros. This house was reconstructed from another will, which is kept in the Dominican archives. So it must have been quite a house, no? Apart from the house, there were adjunct structures. There was a kitchen apart from the house, and also a tambobo. This term they were not able to translate into from Tagalog to Spanish, so they retained the Tagalog word tambobo. And based on a map of Bocaue of the 18th century, we see here such a separate house separate from the kitchen, and there's a tambobo, which is the largest structure in this area. So we can imagine the size of the house and kitchen and storehouse, bodega, warehouse of Doña Juana Manahin and her husband. The will is very distinct to show which belonged to her husband and which belonged to her, and which were conjugal property. So each of them had to be divided separately. In their house, there's just basically one bedroom. They had the following images inside the bedroom. A carved image of the Christ, a print of the Holy Family, a print of San Roque, and a full statue of San Nicolas de Tolentino. It's interesting that the names Nicolas and Roque appear many times in the Testament. And also in the Church of Bulacan itself, there's a side retablo where there are images of San Nicolas and San Roque. So it would be interesting to study the devotions to San Roque and San Nicolas in Bulacan. And just outside the door of their bedroom, they had the following images, carvings of the of Calvary with the Christ and the Sorrowful Mother and Saint John, a print of Christ on the cross, and a very interesting print. I wasn't able to get the print, but this is the image of Our Lady of Montserrat. So Our Lady of Montserrat is a very small devotion in the Philippines, or had a small devotion in the Spanish time, especially among Tagalogs. There's the biggest devotion, I think, is San Beda now, but it is interesting to see that we have Our Lady of Montserrat in Bulacan at this early time. As to her earthly possessions, she had 1 tael of gold, actually 1 tael and a little more. 1 tael of gold was used to make a sword handle. So this is the closest image I have of a sword handle of gold from the Boxer Codex. 1 tael consisted of 16 piloncitos. So this is so you can imagine slightly how much gold went into the making of such a handle. She also had a petaca in Spanish, but I think in Tagalog the original we would have been tampipi. And this is an image of an antique tampipi where the noli of Jose Rizal was hidden, they say, in Calamba. This is a tampipi of Doña Juana Manahin's time, I guess. It looks like this. Inside, you had a pavilion de lienzo, which actually, pavilion, I thought at first would be a mosquito net, but actually, if it was of canvas, it would have been thicker. So I found that in Ilocos, they have a birthing curtain called a pabillon, which is obviously derived from pavilion, and it has been traditionally used in Paway, and this is a woven one. So I presume that this pavilion de lienzo, blanco, white and plain, would have been an example of a birthing curtain also in Doña Juana Manahin's house. She had a red tapis. This is a tapis from by Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay. I wasn't not able to find an example of a red tapis, but I have a red tapis from the Kalinga. To give you an idea, it's interesting that if you look through the images of textiles, you find most of the textiles, even in the Mian Domingo, colored blue. very hard to, I didn't find any red tapis. And so the red tapis must have been a sign of her status or her symbol, her prestige in the society at that time. She also had a red bed cover made in Lumbang. So I have not been able to get a picture of how a red bed cover would have looked like, but here is, it came from as far away as Lumbang, which shows you the importance of Lumbang even then, of its embroidery and its textile industry. She also had small jars and a small collection of jars and earthenware vessels such as titinaha, which may have been the tapayan, and tibua, which is a smaller china vase. So actually very few containers in her house, and very few silverware actually. But she had agricultural tools. This peine actually means comb, and I suspect it would have been like this, of iron, which they called balombong. I tried to look this up in the dictionary. The word I cannot find the word. It must have been extinct by now. Balombong. And then 2 pairs of raros, also of iron. And she mentions 2 bangkas, one large one made in Abukay, and another one which they called tungalan, which both of the bangkas were used to ferry passengers and people, and they were a charge. So here she mentions that one bangka rendered 1.5 real a month, and the other, the larger one, rendered 4 reals a week. Sorry, for weeks. Now these are rates in weeks. So that was one of the sources of income, the rent of these bangkas. Then she had a small collection of furniture, an old table, and a dolan, which is our Tagalog dulang, a round one. And so this is an example of a round dulang. Actually, just the house was, despite the hugeness of the house, she had very little properties inside. She may have given them away already, but she had many slaves. The couple had many slaves, which is rather interesting for this time for this century. For the clauses 130 to 134, these are the clauses pertaining to the slaves. So she had Gaspar de los Reyes. The slaves are also appraised according to parts of the body. For Gaspar de los Reyes, the whole body belonged to Doña Juana, whom the couple bought for 80 pesos. They bought him from a Spanish, from Jose de la Vega. And his wife was Maria Sayahin. So 1/4 part of her was free, meaning she did not have to serve the family every time. 3/4 of her life, she would serve the family. And they had 4 children. And because of the mother's 1/4 freedom, 3/4 of them also belonged to the couple. So they had Roque Vicente, Juan Bolinao, Tomas de los Reyes, Maria Vicha, and Maria Teresa. Interestingly, they do not carry the family name of the parents except for Tomas de los Reyes. And the youngest, Maria Teresa, had 5 children: Ignacio, Colaseto, Rosita, Lucky, and Ana. I suspect Colaseto is the nickname from Nicolas. Parang Kulas natin ngayon. Each of these persons is mentioned by name, and the prices are also mentioned. And Doña Juana Manahin set some of them free, but also retained some of them to serve her until her death. So their life histories are also in the testament. They also had slaves from different parts of the world. So we had Luis Macasa, who was Makassar. They had Nicolas Talipsa, who was a Bengal. We had Luis, who was also a Malabar. He have a Malabar, but of course this is an elite Malabar. And we have Agustina Atesan, a Kafra. So it must have been a Negrito like this person here. The Bengal, the Makassar, and the Kafra were the most expensive. 80 pesos, 75 pesos, and 70 pesos. Oh, we also have Nicolas Dayo, 75 pesos. So the slaves are very expensive. And some of them were freed by Doña Manahin, and others were retained because many of them had escaped, and Doña Juana was quite peeved with their escaping. So she said, if ever any of them is captured or goes back, to continue serving her, and for their slavery to be continued with whoever would inherit them. For all her richness, ironically, Manahin is derived from mana, which means pamana or heritage. So she was quite wealthy with her inheritance, but she was not too happy with her younger relatives who are mentioned at length towards the end of her document. So she has a nephew, Don Roque Garcia, whom she says in clause 159, she leaves certain lands to him because she is her relative, and she says, do not contradict this because this is my will. But apparently, she was Doña Juana was dictating her will for maybe at least 2 days because she had the time to revoke that. In 163, in the clause 163, she says, now I revoke whatever I have given Roque Garcia, because although I had him called to see me for one last time, he did not come. So I revoke all that I have given to him. Quite sad. But she reserved her greatest despair and disdain for her adopted son, which takes more than 3 pages. And in truth, I felt very weak. I was telling Dr. Florendo that after I had finished reading this, I felt quite low and I had to stop working because it was very painful to read how she said. So I will read my translation in English. So her last clause refers to Don Antonio Manuel de la Vega Espinete, son of Joseph de la Vega, whom we adopted. And it is well known that I am not his legitimate mother, by which is that he does not care about me, no hace caso de mí, and in no way has he alleviated my work, and now my sickness when I am sick in my sick bed, sick of what God has seen fit to give me, and in no way has he taken care of me. And now I have no hope that he will change his ways. From now, I separate myself from him and revoke all that I had disposed to concede him, although the document we had prepared is with him, and although he may be my legitimate son. Since he had no pity on me or my husband, from this moment I revoke all the previous statements, documents, writings, bills that I had made in previous times. So in the end, all the money that she had inherited and all the lands would go to the maintenance for prayers for her soul, as dictated in the Capellania. So Doña Juana must have died soon after 23 July 1691. It was translated into Spanish 3 years later to put into effect for the Spaniards to put this into effect because they didn't understand Tagalog. And in 3 years later after that, another document was drawn up to clarify the lands of her husband, Don Bernabe Aligid, this time written in Tagalog, and this document has also survived, thankfully. In the liquidation of the 1694 document, there are receipts, some in Spanish and in Tagalog, so it would be very useful to research or go over these also. Towards the end of this document, the lands in question and the pertinent expenses are liquidated. So we have more documents to work on, and as I said, more material for others to pick up and present. So with this, I end my talk, and I invite you all to go into these documents. Maybe we can have them translated and printed later on for others to use. It is 70 pages long, but I already have the transcription. I can pass it on to you. Thank you, Paul. Now Edgar Allan Zambrano will continue the talk on the lands of Juana Manahin.
Magandang umaga po. Maayong aga. Medyo maliwanag lang. Okay. So what I'm going to discuss is about the lands of Doña Juana Manahin based on her will. Okay. Okay, so I'll try to finish in less than 10 minutes. Okay, so her will again is 170 clauses or items. 103 of those concerns her land properties. That's items number 24 to 167, except those mentioned by Sir Ricky on other things. Okay, so this is Bulacan province, Bulacan town. It's actually K now to distinguish it with the province. This is the map of present-day Bambang in Bulacan, called then as Pueblo de Banban, but it was under the town of Bulacan, and this is where Juana Manahin and her family lived. So the lands mentioned in the will, ito po yun, no? So this is the map of Bulacan town. So what we see here in blue, that's Baguio. There's a place there. It is actually now Bagumbayan, Barangay Bagumbayan, but there's a place there mentioned that she bought a property in Bagumbayan. The red one is Bamban, which is now Bambang, where we could also find Maypolo, no? But this name is no longer existing, Maypolo. We also have Karapdapan, formerly also Dapdap, which is now Santa Ana in green. The orange one is Mabolo, which is now May Santol. And the yellow one is Taliptip, which still retains its name. And it is actually now the site of an airport project by the government. So there's actually a mention in the will that some sort of a third part of Taliptip was bought by Doña Juana Manahin. Now the names there in white, we are actually not yet sure where these places are today, but most likely these are also in the vicinity of Bulacan town, in Bambang, or in neighboring areas, neighboring towns of Bulacan. Okay, so the will, as Sir Ricky said, 70 pages, but the will can be analyzed in many ways. Number one is doing a table on the land properties of Juana Manahin, indicating the location, the description, the previous owner, the mode of acquisition could be pawned to them, they bought it, or minana ni Juana Manahin yung property, yung presyo, at yung item number doon sa will. Also, places where the properties were located, like for example in ALLAN, and as I mentioned earlier in Baguio. Okay. Also, the list down of the previous owners of Juana Manahin's properties, and it's interesting that the surnames in the will, like Kalimot, no, and Marlang Sakay, still exist to this day. Base po dyan sa isang marker, bagong marker sa simbahan ng Bagong Bayan. And I'm sure other surnames in the document still exist at present. Another one is toponyms of the names. Kasi at first medyo mahirap i-locate yung ang mga lugar, pero basing it on the toponyms, medyo madali nang na-locate, at malaking tulong din yung libro ni Ian Alfonso on the toponyms of the barangays of present-day Bulacan town. Okay, so the lands, yung sukat, actually, ang binabanggit na sukat doon ay either loan or kabalita. Ang loan or luwang or habas, it is called pita today. Wala itong specific measurement. Basically, kung kayo ay nasa bukid, ito yung isang rectangle na makikita sa bukid o sa palayan. Yan ang loan. No? In Bulacan town, yung background ko actually, that is in Bambang, in Bulacan. Kung makikita po natin, iba-iba ang sizes, no, ng mga loan or mga loanes dyan sa lugar na yan. Malalaki yung size ng loanes compared doon sa ibang lugar sa probinsya. Sinilip ko din yung satellite images sa ibang probinsya, at malalaki talaga yung sizes ng luwang dito sa bayan ng Bulacan. Ang total luwanes na pagmamay-ari nila, no, based sa pagbili sa minana at doon sa mga isinangla sa kanila, ay 190.25 luwanes, no? So ganyang kadami yung kanyang property in terms of luwanes. Also, base doon sa will, she also had 9 kabalitas. No? 1 kabalita is equals to 2,794 square meters. So 9 kabalita is less than 1 kinyon. 1 kinyon is actually 10 kabalitas. And these are measurements during that time. So that's 25,146 square meters, or today, kung mas madali, is equivalent to 2.51 hectares. Okay. So basically during that time, doon sa kanyang will, a kabalita could cost 7 tostones, 3 pesos and 50 centavos to 30 pesos. Ang tostones or salapi ay 50 centavos. Ngayon, ang reales ay 12.5 centavos. So 4 na reales ay isang toston. Ang 2 toston ay isang piso. No? 2 tostones ay isang piso. On the average, a loan could cost 2 pesos and 23 centavos, or around 2 pesos and 2 reales that time. And 1 peso during that time could buy less than 1 loan, but in some instances, a half loan could be bought for an average amount of 4.66 pesos. So I think it depends on the locations of the properties, and itong mga mahal na loan na ito ay located sa Bambang. And the picture that you see there are samples of the reales. Okay. So, and the picture that we have there, actually, that is a Bambang in Bambang, no? Because Bambang is a canal or an irrigation canal. It could also mean a moat, but this is a Bambang, an irrigation canal in Bambang. So the total amount of properties owned, purchased, and pawned to them, at least because there are properties na hindi nakalagay, hindi naka-indicate yung amount ng binayaran, or doon sa minana hindi rin nakalagay. So at least ang amount ng kanilang ng property niya ay 571 pesos and 27 centavos. No? So yung ganyan, well ngayon, ganyan kaliit na pera ay napakalaki na ng mga panahon na yon. No? Okay, actually that is my last slide. But just to conclude, the document is very, very important because it shows the Tagalog society during that period, no, late or 17th century. And it also shows yung legal documents, no, yung legal dealings during that time, as well as the women, no, women power, no, during that period. Anyway, this picture that we see here, this is the chapel of Bambang. This was formerly actually a parish, and this is dedicated to San Roque, and this dates back to the Spanish period with renovations done in the mid 20th century. So yan lamang po ang aking po at magandang umaga.
Maraming salamat, speakers, Professor Jose and Mr. Sembrano. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting paper. And you're right, it gives us insight into how Tagalog society was like in the late 17th century and how a will can be a historical document, no? And the amount of pathos that was there, how Professor Jose found it hard to read also because of the very emotional state that Juana Manahin was then in, or when she was dictating the will. So we will reserve our questions later. Now we will go to Dr. NELA Florendo. May we have your presentation?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? But I can't see myself on the screen. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Very well, ma'am. Yes, very well. We can hear you.
Okay, I think I can just proceed even if you don't see me. My paper for this morning is very much different from those that were presented earlier because it doesn't focus on a particular historical event or a series of historical events. Instead, you treat my presentation today as historical pedagogy. In a way, it's related to pandemics because the health crisis now becomes the context of teaching history. I've been teaching history for the past 40 years, but this is the first time I am now engaged in remote learning, particularly conducting class fully online. So please treat my paper as some kind of a reflection of this of one semester journey in conducting classes online. And I'd like to dedicate this paper to all teachers who, like me, struggled to shift to online teaching because of the situation right now. We revised our Philippine history curriculum syllabus, I should say, in 2018, just in time with the entry of the first batch of the K-12 program. Now, while many of the faculty members have been introduced to blended learning, I more or less was faithful to face-to-face classes, but because of the pandemic, we, of course, were forced to shift to another platform. Now, the University of the Philippines uses Moodle as its learning management system. And here you can see from this page, a message to the users. So we can treat the virtual classroom as some kind of a space. It says here, within this site, you shall be able to access your study courses, relevant content, materials, files, links, readings, etc. And you can also use this site to communicate and interact with your teachers and fellow students. So it says here, enjoy your stay. So it's really like a space. Now let me walk you through my virtual learning classroom. I would like to bring you to the actual site. For those of you who have been using Google Classroom, you may see certain parallelisms. However, the University of the Philippines purchased Moodle purposely because it wanted to make its site more secure, and at the same time, there is some kind of a curating process that takes place within the site. So this is my site. Any student, depending on the role of the student, logs into the site. And let's go to History 1. I handle several classes, and I would like to bring you to History 1, which is Philippine history. And here in this virtual classroom, the faculty is required to put all the policies, the syllabus, and here I have a portion here where I put announcements and reminders to my students, including here we have our guidelines for the suspension of classes during typhoons. And so now we go to the different parts of the course. We came up with a system-wide syllabus, which consists of 10 topics, which would more or less be equivalent to the type of periodization for Philippine history. So the first part is always an introduction, and it is during this time where we are supposed to introduce the students and hone their thinking historically. Here below the course objectives and topics, you can see that the resources have been prepared for the students, the videos they have to watch, the links, including chats or fora. When you say forum, students are required to put their reactions to maybe readings, and then they react to each other. Fora, when you say forum. Now the second part, the first part is very important because this is where students now are shaped in terms of their thinking historically. So we deal about handling evidence, sources, what makes a historical event, what makes an event historical, and this becomes the foundation to the next parts of the course. The second part is the geological and geographical environment of the Philippines. Now that we have typhoons battering us, I think this should always be given importance. And again, here you find the resources for the class where we put now certain oral traditions that talk about the geological formation in the Philippines, physical environment. And this particular part of the course usually ends with a discussion of our territorial claims. The third part is on peopling of the Philippines. Again, we have resources, readings, as well as videos, and also a forum where students discuss the reactions to the several theories. And of course, the emphasis here also is on the Austronesian migration and the legacy. Now, because of problems of connectivity, usually a faculty should be prepared with messages like students saying we were not able to attend class because we had power interruption, etc. So immediately after a discussion, I usually post the slides, if not the recording of the discussion. The fourth module is on the early settlements in the Philippines. And here we are now issue-oriented. We discuss specific problems, like, for instance, the issue about state formation, even in during the early settlements, the issue of class, whether class existed or not. And here I usually make use of certain visuals and tell students to be critical about these visuals. For instance, Amaya maybe is critically acclaimed, but at the same time, here we can derive, for instance, certain terms of early settlements like Banwa or Ripon, the difference between Datu and Raha, etc. Now, we see historical continuities and we ask them to watch Ang Huling Prinsesa, where here we have a binukot who exists in an indigenous community. And if we were to trace therefore the roots of the binukot, it would go back to the early settlements in the Philippines when women occupied very important roles in the community. Now the rest, we now find certain readings. And here I posted again the slides of the discussion. Topic 5 is now the Filipino communities in the context of change. So while we are celebrating the quincentennial of the arrival of Christianity in the Philippines and the first circumnavigation of the world, here we can see that the emphasis of the syllabus is on 1565. As usual, it follows the same format. There are links here which I placed to give them an idea of, or shall I say, a background of the European setting before the onset of Spanish colonialism. Here, I usually ask them to deal with primary sources. So during this pandemic, I had to link them to Blair and Robertson, to an online source for Blair and Robertson, and I assigned the students certain periods and certain things. So they are to choose a primary source, analyze these primary sources, and then we were supposed to get into a second tier of discussion. So from very specific primary sources, we now get into generalizations. Topic 6 now deals with the formation of national consciousness. And here, I must say that online teaching has more or less challenged me to make slides that are not mere visual materials, but slides that set you and the student into a dialogue. I think I can bring you to these slides for a while. So, for instance, one set of slides would now be the perspectives of the Philippine Revolution. But of course, if you discuss this, it has to take into consideration the context before the 1896 revolution, the resistances, and in the process, pose questions to them. Stimulating questions like, were we a nation in 1896, etc. Then let me go through the other parts. Topic 7. Topic 6 ends with the Philippine-American War, the Spanish-American War, then the Philippine-American War. And one good resource for online teaching would be Savage Acts, which would show different perspectives on the claim for the American occupation of the Philippines. Topic 7 is the American period until the Japanese occupation, and the resources are also here. I prepared slides for American policies and their impact, and a reader-friendly material from Ricardo TROTA Jose on the Japanese occupation. Normally, we watch the film The Battle of Manila, but right now, it's not possible to link them because they're not available online and because there are usually issues of copyright. Now, independence and national policies would be the next topic here, topic 8. 1945 to 1972. And for this particular period, whether online or face-to-face, students are usually asked to analyze the presidencies, their policies within the context of the Cold War. Topic 9 is from 1972 to 1986. And of course, this would now be the period of dictatorship. And while we haven't reached this part of the course, we normally look at documentaries on the martial law. There are many and they are available online, which students can view their class hours. And of course, we deal with the issue of historical revisionism. Now, the last topic, hopefully we will reach this. I'd like to reach this because this is a period for 1986 until the present with the rise of populist regimes. Now, so what have I learned from this? What have I learned from this online teaching? There is definitely a process for preparing a virtual classroom, from redesigning the syllabus so that you are now focused on the learner rather than on you as the faculty. We list down the tasks, how will we deliver the instruction, and what are the resources available. Now, what did I miss with online teaching? One, of course, we always miss the personal learning environment, which face-to-face classes, interaction now provides. And of course, when you go face-to-face, there's immediate and spontaneous feedback. There are limitations in research in the sense that, well, you have to keep the students protected so that they are restricted, therefore, to online sources. Whereas in the past, we would go out for field trips, we would go out for oral history, for interviews. Now, of course, there's always the issue of structuring. It's not, I realize that for online teaching, it may not be appropriate unless students are able to display their good management of time. It would be best to go structured and ask students to submit requirements in some regimented mode. I'm sorry for that. It sounds a bit authoritarian. So all in all, I would say that in distance learning, there is this particular maxim, less is more. I know that each particular semester we struggle with trying to meet everything that is found in the syllabus. But for me, what's important at the end of this course is that students are able to determine when events are considered historical. And in that sense, they are thinking historically, they're able to manage causes, determine change, determine impact. They're able to apply the methods of history in the handling of sources and evidence, and also be critical with historical interpretations. I always say you don't have to be a history major to think historically. Now, let me end by saying I got these images during Teacher's Day. It says here, no Google or technology can replace a teacher ever. We all believe in that, I suppose. And it says here, technology won't replace teachers, but let's be cautious because it says here, but teachers who use technology will probably replace teachers who do not. Thank you, and I think I'll end my presentation with this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Florendo. Now, may we call the speakers for the open forum, Professor Jose and AEA. May we have you, please open your videos. Okay, so actually we have 4 questions here for Professor Jose and EA. So the first question actually is from Dr. Florendo. Professor Ricky Jose, Very interesting paper, but heartbreaking. Is there evidence that Joseph de la Vega was just interested in the wealth of Juana Manahin? Will you extend your research to know how her will was implemented? What happened to her properties? And another question, so I'll just lump the two together. How much of historical documents in archives are written by common people or Indios?
Thank you for the question. And I think I have not yet recovered from my heart failure, kumbaga, from the reading the document. Ang lungkot talaga ng document ni this, sa kabila ng kayamanan ni Manahin, malungkot pa rin siya sa pagkamatayan niya, no? What I presented was about half of the document I found in Valladolid. This is the Spanish translation of the Tagalog will. The second half is what they did to the will, because they found out that that her husband, Bernabe Aligid, did not have a testament, or they could not find it. So they had to reconstruct it, and that reconstruction is in Tagalog. So that will be an interesting thing, and I hope I or other people who younger than me or more technologically qualified than me can go over this, no? Because I'm sure that Tagalog will lead us to many obsolete Tagalog words, such as yung balong-balong na yan, no? So that's up for study. And the reason that this document, I think this is not a lowly person. I think she's one of the elite of Bulacan. And I think a lot of her lands were inherited because her husband was, as I said, governor of the province. Hindi lang siya mayor, kundi governor of the province. And that they had many connections with the previous mayors of Bulacan. So she was definitely not a lowly person, but high standing. And the reason that the document survived is because it is actually a capellania, which is a chaplaincy where certain amounts are paid to given to different religious organizations to continue praying for her soul. So since she apparently did not pass on many of her treasures to her relatives, she had none. She did not mention many, and most of the properties went to the prayers for her soul. That's why may copies Augustinians. And I heard from the archivist of the Archdiocese of Manila that there are many also such chaplaincies in the archives of Manila. But I think the one that I have presented is rather rare because it is of a woman, and it is of a Tagalog woman. And the date is rather early because many of these are from the 18th century. So that's why I presented this one. There are other wills that I have found. There's another one by Doña Catalina Sangnilay from 1650, which is even earlier. But this is so much shorter. As I presented the longer one of Juana Manahin. Yung kay Catalina Sangnilay, maybe I can present it in another conference. She also was a wealthy woman, but not as rich as Juana Manahin. There's another one by Miguel de Pasuay, also from the 17th century, which is in the UST archives. So I'm going to work on that for an article next year. So I think this study on wills has a lot. We have a lot to learn from the wills of these people. Reconstructing, especially the 17th century Tagalogs. Hopefully there'll be wills from other ethnicities so we can reconstruct of Ilocanos or Kapampangan, for example. So we get a better view rather than just yung mga away ng governor at saka arsobispo for the 17th century.
Yes. So we have two more questions here. Again, addressed to you, Professor Jose NPA. How would you estimate or assess the value of Doña Juana Manahin's assets during that period? And another one, when was slavery abolished in the Philippines? As it seems at the time of the will, slavery is very much alive here in the country.
Yung first question, ubayo ka na kay EA, but mahina ko sa math kasi. Yung sa slavery, there is a book by William Henry Scott on slavery in the Philippines, which I have, but I don't have it here with me now kasi dahil sa lockdown, nasa kabilang building yun. Well, hindi ko na, but I would refer the one who asked a question on this book. I was rather surprised myself na meron pa pala tayong mga alipin, even among the Tagalog society. I thought mga Kastila lang merong alipin. But ito, marami siyang alipin at marami mga foreign alipin. So obviously the practice was still alive at that time. But I will refer the questions to William Henry Scott. EA, ikaw na.
Okay. Okay po. Yung actually mahirap po i-assess pero basing the properties, I think these are significant tawag ito yung pagmamay-ari ang kanyang pagmamay-ari dahil kitang-kita sa kanyang will na karamihan sa mga inilagay niya roon ay tungkol sa kanilang mga lupain, and itong mga lupain ito, I think these are not small properties, na siguro isang rectangle lang sa bukid, pero these are big land properties. Like for example, she has 190 luwanes, and again in Bulacan malalaki yung luwang doon, and obviously talagang malalawak yung property niya. So I think these are significant assets of Juana Manahin and her husband.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Now for Dr. Florendo, how do UP Baguio students fare online academically compared to students within a classroom arrangement? Is the quality of student output the same between the online arrangement and face-to-face classroom arrangement?
I thought I'll answer the question after that. There's a question. I'll just go to that just as a backgrounder. When we did the GE syllabus in time for the arrival of the K-12 graduates, we really intended it not as a reading course. So it's not a reading course because we know that students did not have a Philippine history in high school. So it will have to be, it doesn't have to be remedial in a sense, but just a revitalized type of syllabus. And so the question now is, I would say that there are some pluses for an online course, the way I handle it, because I have fora integrated in the activities. By the way, when I say online, I'm speaking of synchronous, that's real time, and asynchronous, where students do their work outside. Some students think that when you go online, you're always synchronous, which is not the case. And in fact, many students have complained that it looks like they have more work now that we're having classes online. Why? Because that's probably one reflection which faculty members should have. Are we giving too much to students only because we leave them to attending to whatever we give them, in contrast to face-to-face where, of course, you are able to calculate the requirements. So are there, in terms of quality output, I would say that they're the same. They're the same. I mean, in the forum, I could see how critical students are. It could also be because we also have a crop of students who are exposed to digital sources, we're borderless learning, so that I would say they're very critical. One advantage is that when you put a forum in your class, everyone participates. In contrast to the face-to-face where sometimes there are some who dominate discussions. So I would say they're just the same. I mean, in terms of outputs, the only weakness at this point, I don't know if we continue, the pandemic ends, and then UP tells us that, well, we don't go back to the past, we continue with blended learning, there's always something online, then probably they can improve on research. That research is not strictly being given a website and you take your primary sources there, but there are other ways of doing research, richer forms of historical methodologies which they can apply. It's on research where I would say the online classes right now is rather weak. The other one is, how do we measure? What about the measurement of student performance? I still give quizzes. And of course, there's always the possibility that, maybe they copied from each other or they consult each other. Sige na, pagbigyan nyo na yung ganon. But at the same time, there are questions that will test the students' critical analysis. And they would differ. Like, choice of events. The first quiz that I gave them was, okay, choose an event and tell me why it's historical. Okay, maganda na yun. What are the primary sources on this pandemic, and rank them from applying internal and external criticism. Internal criticism, particularly, who would be the most credible? And some would say President Duterte would be the most credible because he's in power. Then you know that there's something to correct there. That anybody who's in power is not a guarantee that he's credible or telling the truth. So here, maybe it's a matter of giving them questions that would challenge them. Okay, thank you. Dami ko lang sinabi.
Thank you, ma'am. So, thank you very much, speakers, Professor Jose, Sir EA, and Professor NELA. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. So, just a reminder, those who want to get certificates for the webinar, the evaluation will be posted in the FB page of the PNHS at 12 o'clock noon. So stick around. By 12, it will be posted. And please accomplish it for you to get your certificate for the webinar. So as a way of saying thank you, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat, sa lahat po ng mga speakers, kay Professor Planta, kay Professor Earl, CLEOPE, kay Professor Ricky Jose, Sir EA Sembrano, Ma'am Nela Florendo. Maraming salamat po. So organizers po, to PNHS, to Dr. Churchill for always being there to support us, and the NCCA and the PSSC. Maraming salamat po. Sa mga participants, meron pa pong nagme-message, meron galing pong South Cotabato at Davao del Norte. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pagdalo sa aming seminar, sa aming conference, virtual conference. So without much ado, thank you very much. We're now closing the conference. We wish you a very wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.